Thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And also thanks Product School for inviting me to speak at this webinar. Today I'll be talking about navigating ambiguity through prioritization. Let me quickly share my screen for you guys. All right, a little bit about me before we get started. My name is Akash Gupta, and I'm currently based in San Francisco. Broadly speaking, my journey so far can be categorized into two buckets. One is the startup and entrepreneurial world, and the second is working at large tech companies. Like many people, I had this startup bug within me, and I started working as the fourth employee at the super early stage educational technology e-learning SaaS startup out of the Tufts and MIT Media Lab. Shortly thereafter, I co-founded Brisk, which is a SaaS appointment booking platform for small, medium businesses. While I loved wearing multiple hats at startups, I really wanted to know what it was like to work at a larger company. And the problem of digitally transforming a traditional office supplies retail giant into an e-commerce platform really excited me and drew me to Staples. I worked at Staples for about 4 years, launching staples.com with a big team there. However, my love for e-learning took me back to Facebook, where I helped launch their global e-commerce platform for all advertisers around the globe. I'm currently a product manager at Uber, and I'm working on Uber's growth and engagement platform across all lines of businesses, whether it's rides, whether it's eats, driver, and a bunch of cool things like Uber groceries as well. All right, enough about me, but over the course of the next 30 minutes or so, I'll be walking through some of the approaches that have worked for me as a product manager. Whether you're an aspiring PM or seasoned PM, or just someone who's curious about product management, I believe some of these topics will be extremely relatable, and hopefully you'll come out of it being more aware. Hopefully you'll also be able to learn how to make better decisions and just be more conscious about decision making. I also hope you understand what it's like to prioritize in the day-to-day life of a PM, what it's like to manage conflicting priorities and make trade-offs, drive stakeholder alignment through communication. And lastly, I'd like to share some of my key learnings that have really helped me grow as a PM. All right, this title in general, let's just take a step back and understand what this really means, right? It can seem really complex when I think about it, but what is ambiguity? Ambiguity in the world of product management is just the quality of being open to more than one interpretation. And as a PM, you gotta work with so many different disciplines, so many different stakeholders, whether it's designers, developers, data scientists, people in finance, leadership, executives, and everyone has a point of view, right? So as a result, there's so much vagueness and so much inexactness that it's really a lot of people who come together when it comes to driving a particular solution. As a result, it's sort of super important to prioritize. But what is prioritization exactly? Essentially, prioritization is the action or the process of deciding the relative importance or the urgency of things. What might seem important to someone else might not be as important to you. And what might seem like an absolute burning fire might not really be a burning fire. So with that in mind, I'd like to kick this off by quoting Dwight Eisenhower, the 34th president of the United States. He said, "I have two kinds of problems, the urgent and the important. What is important is seldom urgent, and what is urgent is seldom important." And let's take a step back here and think about what is an urgent task, right? Urgent tasks are basically those tasks that require immediate attention. These are the to-dos that you just literally have to do right away. They're usually short-term and time-sensitive. And when you think about it, urgent tasks usually put us in a reactive mode and are marked by sort of defensive, negative, hurried, and sort of narrowly focused mindsets. Important tasks, however, are things that basically contribute to your long-term growth, to your mission, your values, and your goals of your company, right? Sometimes important tasks can also be urgent, But typically they're not if you sort of plan in advance, because these are usually not time sensitive and they're sort of more long-term. When we focus on important activities, usually we operate in a proactive mode, which helps us sort of stay calm, be rational, and really be open to new opportunities with people. And while this distinction might seem really intuitive, people frequently fall into the trap of believing that all urgent activities are also important. And I believe that this propensity likely has its roots in some evolutionary history, as our ancestors concentrated more on short-term concerns rather than long-term strategy, as tending to immediate stimuli, like a charging saber-toothed tiger. That could mean the difference between life and death, and it was super urgent. However, modern technology with 24-hour news, blasting feeds on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and text messaging with WhatsApp as well, right? That's only heightened this deeply ingrained mindset. And our stimulus producing tech basically treats all this information as equally urgent and pressing. You'll notice that Miley Cyrus's tour gate is often given the same weight as COVID policy changes in California. Now, with that said, I'd like to dive a little deeper into what's really helped me as a product manager really make decisions, and how I use some sort of decision-making matrix to navigate ambiguity on a day-to-day basis. So here are some of the tips and tricks I use. I broadly categorize my work into 4 quadrants, right? The first quadrant on the top left is basically tasks that are urgent as well as important. These are, of course, essential and time-sensitive activities, and not dealing with them immediately will result in problematic and near catastrophic situations. Let's say the lack of financial resources could result in the immediate crashing halt of a particular project or a particular launch. Or let's say dealing with an unforeseen circumstance at work. There's something that might have just happened that day in terms of bad press release that you need to immediately deal with and mitigate the disaster. Another example here is that maybe the user just cannot log on to the app, or basically there's a strike in all of your city. These are basically things that are just things you have to deal with immediately, right? And if you don't do it right, you'll sort of experience negative consequences if you sort of procrastinate them. There are also specific skill sets here, right, that basically require you to do it. These tasks, are things that you can't really delegate because, for instance, here, stakeholders really want updates from you, not from someone on your team, because you're the point of contact who's basically representing the success of the entire product. But ideally, very few tasks should sort of fall into this category, because if things are important, they should never really reach a point of urgency. However, of course, there are actually emergencies, and there's things that you can't really foresee. Now let's move to the second quadrant, right? The top right quadrant. And this is basically the quadrant or where you always want to be in when you're working on an important task, but there's nothing sort of urgent. This is like the utopia when it comes to a product manager. Tasks in this category are usually things that don't really impact your goals, but are still part of your job. They deserve your attention, but they don't really need to be handled right away and can be scheduled for a later time. These are tasks that I say that you should plan and decide. For example, filling out performance reviews was super important when I was at Facebook and Uber. However, it's not something that you need to take on right away. You know that it's a key way to document people's performance, to help them grow, but it's something that you can plan for, right? It's not something that's extremely urgent and you need to sort of take on in that very moment. These could also be your long-term goals. For example, building productive relationships with your team, your juniors, with your clients, with your potential partners, and looking for and researching new skills to acquire, or even identifying and documenting risks in your upcoming project. This kind of task is not usually urgent, right? It could happen now, it could happen in the next month, the next 3 months, but ideally majority of these tasks should sort of fall in this box. And it's best to schedule your work so you're always ahead of your problems. Rather than reacting, you are more proactive. Okay, let's move to quadrant number 3, which is the bottom left one, which is the place where tasks are usually categorized as not important but urgent. These are tasks that I usually think about delegating, and I'll walk through this with a few examples. Tasks in this category usually label as interruptions. They need to be done right now, which means it makes them feel very important, even though they don't really add a lot of value to your work. It feels good to sort of cross them off, right? But they don't really help accomplish anything significant. And here, when I say not important, does not mean that these tasks are of menial or of little value, but it just means that these are not so important that you have to do them yourself. In many cases, however, these tasks cannot be ignored, so you want to delegate them to other people. Let me walk you through 3 examples here of how you can delegate better to sort of navigate ambiguity as a product manager. Let's say a developer is working with an unfamiliar technology and he or she comes up to you with a bunch of different questions. And answering his or her questions is obviously an urgent task because you need to unblock them, you need to make sure that they can continue to execute on their project, but it's not an important task for you yourself to handle. In this instance, what I've noticed is that the best way to be productive is to have the developer maybe speak with someone else who really understands the nuances of the technology and would love to actually take that extra step and deep dive into technical trade-offs with that particular developer. Another example of delegation, and not necessarily call this delegation, but is just saying no, right? Ever so often, someone from your organization will ask for your help and you want to be a team player. So, you're tempted to give them, some of the time you can, but no is a perfectly valid response to request for help. You don't have to drop everything that you're doing in that very moment, though you should be polite about it, of course. And this usually comes with some experience around how you sort of, can say no and still be friends. And I'll talk through this a little bit more as we move forward in our presentation. And when you're saying no, you're actually just delegating back to the person who was trying to delegate to you in the very first place. So just because it's important to someone doesn't mean it's important for you. And I know you will sort of build this out when you think about stakeholder communication. Another example here is, let the software do it, right? Delegating doesn't just mean handing off tasks to people. You can also delegate it to softwares. And in many cases, this is often cheaper and faster as you automate the task. So furthermore, you don't have to actually delegate the entire task. Your stakeholder reports, for example, require just a lot of tedious pulling of data, formatting of reports. And you can actually automate this with tools like Coda. Also, if you're fielding a lot of questions about queries, or you should sort of work on a process that allows people to be redirected to maybe a self-service Tableau dashboard where people can slice and dice different vectors and basically get the answers that they need. Hopefully that's a good example of how we can deal with things that are not important but urgent. Moving to quadrant 4, and these are tasks that I think you should sort of eliminate or deprioritize. And these are essentially our time-wasting activities in quadrant 4 that don't really create much impact. They don't really help you build a product or even help the team grow. In fact, they usually distract you from the more valuable tasks. These are activities like social media or like falling into browsing deals of Amazon. However, these don't necessarily have to be non-work related activities. There are plenty of activities as a PM that you need to look into that basically you should eliminate. Let me give you another example. Let's say you outlined a new product feature on a whiteboard with your team. Everyone on your team understands the writing and the images on board, but you don't like that it's a little bit sloppy because you're a little bit of a perfectionist. Just recreating your outline looks like you're being more professional and might seem like good work, but it doesn't really make your product or make your team execute any faster or better. So these are the kinds of tasks that you should sort of think about deprioritizing or even eliminating. All right, with that said, I'd just like to wrap up with some general tips that I use here on when it comes to decision making that helps me be more conscious. At Uber, I often make to-do lists, and these are things that I generally recommend all product managers to do. This actually frees up your mind from constant memorization and really reduces information overload. Plus, you'll often find yourself holding yourself a lot more accountable, and you'll know what to prioritize and what to deprioritize. Always ask yourself what is worth doing first. What I use is Mark Twain's eat the frog first principle, right? Eating the frog first will give you tremendous energy and momentum, knowing that you've already done the worst thing already. I keep trackers for stakeholder management for tasks that are really not in your direct control. These tasks usually are places where you are dependent on other people, and you've delegated to other people, and their success is completely critical for your success. Finally, try not to procrastinate much. And that doesn't even mean that you just have to do everything later. However, it does mean that you should not even manage or overmanage your to-do list. All right, switching gears now from decision-making. Hopefully these insights as a PM are helpful. I'd like to talk through what has really helped me when it comes to prioritization. When I think about prioritization, I'd like to break this down into a few vectors. The first one I'd like to talk about is reach. And reach essentially is the number of users or the percentage of customers that would be impacted by what you build, right? These are the users of your platform, essentially. Think about it as the total addressable market and your customer segments. These are usually small, medium, or large. You could be rolling out a feature for the entire world. You could be rolling it out only for a small subset. You might be rolling it out only for millennials or Gen Zs. Essentially, larger the reach of your product, the more you sort of want to prioritize it because it's, looking out for a larger audience. The second thing is customer impact. And this basically buckets how it would impact customers. And customer impact essentially is basically pretty hard to measure and might be different for different industries, might be different for B2C, be different for B2B. So I recommend sort of breaking it up into even smaller buckets when you think about it, and spending time with your direct team, with leadership, to figure out what customer impact really means for you. Usually I think about it as like customer satisfaction and customer delight are sort of the key metrics when I think about what customer impact really looks like. And you must realize you just cannot solve every customer's needs, right? Hence, you need to prioritize. For your team, for example, speed and performance might be extremely important for your customer. However, for another team, design and aesthetics and safety or user safety might be more important for the customer. So really understand what your KPI and what your goal really is here. All right, moving to the next one is around business impact. This is usually the value working on something really brings to the business based on the goals that you have set. For example, business impact could really be driving down costs by making process improvements, or could be just monetization around how much revenue a feature really brings. For example, at Facebook, when you think about business impact, it's about how many people are logging onto your platform, what is the engagement rate, what is the number of monthly active or daily active or weekly active users. It could also mean monetizing ads at Facebook. At Uber, for example, business impact means how many people are taking rides, what are the incremental gross bookings. So really understand how your features is having business impact. Moving to deprioritization costs. And this is something I really use as a product manager. And it's something that really helps me understand or estimate the cost of not solving something, right? That's essentially what a deprioritization or opportunity cost, so to speak, really is. And strategy, as mentioned before, right, is also depends on what you choose not to do. So it's really crucial to understand what would happen if your team decided to not do something. Common ones that I think about here are things like the rise in support costs, the risk of losing a customer, the perception costs, people moving to your competitor. And pick the ones that sort of make the most sense for you and for your product launch. The next one I'd like to talk about when it comes to prioritization is confidence. And this means how confident are you that this will really solve a real problem that in the right way, right? You can have confidence by validating your feature, your product with real users. But you can never really be 100% sure, since these features tend to perform differently with a wider variety of audiences. And my maximum confidence levels are, 90% at most, because I'm extremely critical about, what I want to make sure is 100% reliable. Lastly, and this is something that is absolutely critical, is size and effort. This is basically an estimate on the level of effort it will take to solve for this feature from an engineering standpoint, from a design standpoint, and even from a product and data perspective. This often varies based on the complexity of a problem, the skill sets on your team. As something might really be complex when it comes to delivering that particular feature, which might mean that it takes months to really execute on it. And this is also a good time to really think about the nuances of privacy and the legal risks and how much this impacts your task. All right, with that in mind, I'd like to walk you all through some examples that I've come across in tech that have really helped me prioritize better using this framework. So I'd like to speak about competing priorities and how using these vectors has really helped me make trade-offs better. So on the left, you'll see a typical theme or an example task that you'll see at a tech company. So let's look at row number one. Here the theme is performance, right? Let's say you've been tasked with improving app load time by half a second, right? The reach of this is very, very high. Everyone who opens the app will basically open it half a second faster. So it's your entire audience. When you think of business value and customer impact, right, these are essentially low, because if someone has to wait, depending on your use case, right, if someone has to wait for an extra half a second for opening Amazon, it's not really going to inculcate behavioral change, because they're still going to use Amazon for buying that particular product that they want. Now think about the deprioritization cost here, right? At some companies, half a second might be a big deal, right? You might lose that customer to your competitor. Your customer might have a really bad experience when it comes to not being able to load something on Instagram. Now looking at the confidence and size or effort size here, building out a performance improvement usually is something that needs to be tested, needs to be vetted out. It's a bunch of different complexities that come into this. As a result, unless it's actually tested, I don't really feel like there's a high level of confidence in being able to deliver this solution, right? It's something that might be 0.2 seconds faster, but you really need to understand your goal before you can actually have high level of confidence and reliability on it, specifically for this particular one. Also, building this out might mean months and months of engineering effort. You'd have like an entire army of engineers essentially working on this to fix this. And it's something that you really need to keep in mind when you prioritize something like this, because this would come at the cost of other tasks that are on your roadmap. The second example that I'd like to walk you through is security. And let's take a look at row 2 now. And here the task is essentially adding face recognition features for drivers for ride-sharing companies, right? Here the reach is medium, because if you look at ride-sharing companies, I'd like to say that we have riders, we have eaters, we have a bunch of different audience types on our platform, and this feature for only drivers is for a specific user segment, hence the reach is medium. When you think about business value and customer impact here for this feature, right, it's really low sometimes in terms of business value, because you might not really be working on something that's the most important. It might not really bring in more revenue to your company. And when you think of customer impact, yes, drivers will be happier. However, how much happier will they really be in this situation, right? They can still sort of, log in with two-factor authentication. There's still other ways that, they can get dual verified as well. That would really help them, and it wouldn't really make that much of a dent in terms of customer impact. However, this is still something that's pretty important, right? This is something that if you don't do, right, you sort of lose your customer trust. Riders who are coming on any ride-sharing platform, they might not really believe whether the whether the driver is verified or not. It might lead to bad press. It might lead to churn where people might not use your platform. There are also some safety concerns here, which is pretty critical. So you need to understand what are the sort of privacy implications here, what are the legal risks that come up with this. And when it comes to building out a security solution for face recognition, I often try the Apple face recognition thing and it fails. So it doesn't always operate even when I'm wearing a mask in these times of COVID, right? So when you think about it, it's a pretty, I don't have as high of a confidence level when it comes to knowing whether this feature will actually work. Plus the level of effort and the size of this task is absolutely monumental. It's something that's going to take forever to build out because it has to be robust, it has to be completely comprehensive, and there's a lot of technology involved here. Now let's take a look at how we prioritize something like example number 3 or row number 3. This is what I'd call a bug, right? This is something that the user, let's say, is unable to click the checkout button. Now, the impact of this would be extremely high, right? And imagine if you're on Amazon.com and you cannot hit checkout, or you're an Uber and you cannot hit request a ride, right? It's the reach is basically for every single user. And the impact here, the business value is extremely high, right? You're gonna sort of lose out on revenue if people cannot basically do the most important thing on your platform. You're gonna lose customer trust. Also, the impact to the users, the customer is really high because they would be frustrated. They go to your competitor. And imagine this if in the context of an e-commerce company, right? If you think about your checkout button not working on Black Friday, you've basically just lost out on so much of opportunity. Now let's take a look at the confidence of building this solution out, right? My confidence level for building this out is pretty high. If you look at, research around it, or if you look at what other competitors do, this might just be a hot fix. It might be just something that's gone wrong. And I'm pretty confident that this could be fixed pretty quickly because a lot of companies do it out there. Also, the size of this effort is pretty low. So it's pretty much low-hanging fruit here if something like that has to be really built out. I hope this helps with regards to really understanding how, as a PM, you really think through, navigating different tasks, prioritizing them, understanding how to sort of make these trade-offs, and how these vectors sort of really play out and weigh against each other. And these are some things that you can score as well. You can come up with some sort of rating scale on how to sort of prioritize them. What's a P0 versus what's a P1. But just for the sake of this presentation, I'd like to keep it a little high level, and we could dive into some of the more nuances some other time. All right, I'd now like to take a step back from the weeds of prioritization and methodologies. I know this is extremely important as well. However, what I've found is also super important is these soft skills that you need to navigate at a strategic and tactical level as a product manager. And these are extremely critical when it comes to, being able to manage your stakeholders and set expectations right by communicating frequently. The first thing I'd like to talk about is really knowing your non-negotiables. What does this really mean, right? As a product manager, you need to be really strategic. You need to know what are your constraints, what are your key goals for success of the product. How do you focus on the mission? What does value creation really look like? When you go into a meeting and you are chatting with folks, you need to be able to understand what is your North Star metric that you need to always sort of go for to sort of bust this ambiguity that might come along the way. If you're working, for example, on a efficiency project for cost reduction, right? Know that you cannot have growth at all costs and that your marketing budget might need to be trimmed in order to meet your business goals. So you sort of need to come back to saying that, hey, I cannot negotiate on this. And this is sort of really going to help you when it comes to being able to focus on the most important things. The second thing I'd like to talk about is short-term fixes or hot fixes versus the long-term strategy. And I spoke about this earlier in the webinar as well, but this essentially really helps me rationalize the decision-making process with stakeholders. What I like to say is, are we going to make it work, or are we going to do it right? Are we going to pop an antibiotic, or are we going to be doing the vitamin solution, right? It really helps me break this down when it comes to, framing the conversation a little bit better, And sometimes you can actually be really robust, and you might hit two birds with one stone. The next two bullet points I'd like to talk through are, being open-minded and acceptable and adaptable. Sorry, these are more at a tactical level when you think about it. You can always be wrong, so obviously be humble when it comes to navigating different changes in your teams, but also give credit to your partners and take responsibility. And this is super important when it comes to communication. I always tell people, like, communicate and over communicate, right? I cannot emphasize how much this really helps reduce ambiguity and just makes your partners generally happy. You can set up, weekly cadences, bi-weekly one-on-ones, and this will really help you build strong relationships with engineering teams, with design, with data science, with marketing, finance, operations, and sort of different functions. The last thing also is around empathy, right? Really build empathy to drive better outcomes. Truly listen and acknowledge what your team members' needs really are. Unblock them if you can, right? That's the job as a product manager. Really establish a process around things if you notice an inefficiency. This really helps engineers a lot. And often this can even inspire the team to sort of create a balance between business priorities and between team priorities, thereby preventing people from burning out on your team. And this will actually get you a lot of street cred. Well, I'd like to sort of conclude with some of my key learnings here and what has really helped me. The first thing that has really helped me is just knowing that, you should always have data or keep data at your fingertips. Right? With COVID, you notice that put a lot of businesses and a lot of companies around the globe in a reactive mode where there's so many unknowns that people will have to navigate. I remember this time when an executive literally walked up to me and was like, "Hey, Akash, drop everything else and work on X, Y, and Z." And at these times, you'll really need to be able to push. You really need to learn how to push back at this time. And the only way you could push back is with data, because data is what's going to drive consensus and win arguments. Example here might be, focusing on project A right now would mean basically dropping project B and project C, which would result in X million dollars in savings. We might lose all these users, and we might lose out on monetizing all this entire opportunity. If you have the numbers with you, you can actually push back and set priorities right. The second thing is around, just don't be afraid to over communicate, even if it's not good news. I often notice that people they only like to sort of signify their successes and won't focus much on what's gone wrong. At Uber, and in fact at Facebook as well, working at a large company, you have so many stakeholders to manage who work in so many different time zones that sometimes things just get lost in the shuffle as well, right? Hence, it's critical to over communicate. Over communicating, I think, can also, reset priorities, help you pivot, and just gather feedback a lot quicker. Sending that status report to management really explains the roadblock a lot better. Letting people know that there's a dependency on some API, you might be able to mitigate that particular roadblock by a few days. Telling your eng team that, that their work needs to be redone because a design decision was taken last minute. All of us are sort of faced with these unforeseen circumstances, but, situations change and we need to adapt. Hence, you need to over communicate, and people are usually a lot more understanding than you think when, they're told the truth. And this actually, in fact, really helps you just earn their trust a lot more. And the last thing here is just hone the art of saying no by focusing on the why. And this is actually a skill that you just need to develop over time. But as a PM, you don't really tell people what to do, right? You need to convince them. So you got to focus on the implications of conflicting priorities. You got to really think about how you're approaching something in a constructive mindset and not being very personal. And data, of course, like I said, can be an extremely powerful tool here for you. And this isn't, what I like to say is that this isn't about whether I like you or not, or doing you a particular favor. It's about sort of doing the right thing for what's needed for the business and for the team. So approach these situations about saying no by being conscious, really breaking apart these different trade-offs to make a more constructive and rational decision and create that rational thread between you and your stakeholder. And refrain from basically getting emotional about things and making it about you and me and making it about the feature. It's basically you and the person against the problem, right? So frame those trade-offs well and explain how you're making those decisions by being firm and arriving together. Lastly, everyone at the company basically wants the same thing, right? So say no and stay friends. Learn to say no without sort of offending them and just still be collaborative if needed. Offer your support, for example, field questions for them, and just be kind and helpful in general. This is something that will really take you a long way. Hopefully this is helpful. I'd just like to conclude by saying it's been a pleasure here speaking with you today. And I hope you could acquire some valuable insights today. If you want to reach out to me, my name is Akash Gupta. You can find me on LinkedIn with Akash Gupta. Speak soon and stay safe. Thanks, everyone.